Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
I'm okay, and yourself?
I'm pretty good, pretty good. We're also joined today by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing?
It's good to be here with you, finally, now that you're back.
Yeah, now that I'm back in the saddle, so to speak, I just remind everyone about a little programming note. We will be doing a short version of the Daily Friend tomorrow, which will be out at about 5. It won't be broadcast live on YouTube or the podcast apps, but do check it out. There won't be a normal episode at 1:30. Okay, so let's get into the news of today. And the first one is actually some comments from, I believe it was last week, from Judge Raymond Zondo, our Chief Justice, who says that he thinks that he really hasn't seen much change in Parliament that indicates that the institution would be able to identify and stop attempts to recapture the state. He said, quote, "If another group of people were to do what the Guptas did to pursue state capture, Parliament would still not be able to stop it. That is because I see nothing has changed. And the Constitution provides that the National Assembly is elected to represent the people. When the National Assembly fails to protect the people against state capture, it fails in its duty. When you represent someone in a forum, you're meant to protect that person's interests. And if you fail to do that, you fail in your duty." This drew some outrage from the institution of Parliament itself, the spokesperson for Parliament, saying, "We note the attacks against us. We note that they are directed at the executive insofar as the current policy position of the electoral system is concerned. It is not the place of the Chief Justice to make such public remarks unless and until he is required to adjudicate on the matter with impartiality. The principle of separation of powers is fundamental to our democracy and requires that each branch of government to respect the roles and responsibilities of the other. Chief Justice Zondo's public attack on Parliament encroaches on this doctrine." And basically, I think that some of what the judge went on to say in his remarks is that his state capture report was not being taken particularly seriously, and very few changes had been made in line with it. So, Terence, let me start with you. What do you make of the judge's comments? What do you make of the response from Parliament? What do you make of the story?
Well, I think okay. First of all, to bemoan the comments of the Chief Justice about this, I think somewhat overlooks the fact that he spent 3-4 years dealing with this every day. He wrote this monstrous report, or at least oversaw the drafting of it, put his name to it. I'd like to think he has some expertise, and maybe we should look at that. I don't, my own sense is that this isn't just about electoral systems. But I think that he does have a point, or he does make a kind of oblique point in saying, well, when you're elected to represent something, what are you elected to represent? The people in a very general sense, but you are elected to represent a political party, and that, I think, is where a lot of the problem arises. That we have a political system that's very tightly bound around political party memberships and party discipline. There've been, I think, 4 or 5 official, semi-official commissions that have recommended a change, and if I remember correctly, the first one, the one that's kind of always referred to, chaired by the late Frederick Gonzalez Slabbert, it leaked out that Kara Asmal, who is often regarded as the ANC's moral compass, had said something about how this should be filed in a dustbin. Essentially, the ruling party had no intention of giving up the party hold it has on its MPs. Now, I do think also that the issue is so it is possible to make too much of this, because I don't think that simply moving to a constituency system or allowing independents to stand or whatever is a silver bullet. I think it's one of these kind of faddish things that we go through. If only we had this, then people would they would take the people more seriously. But that can introduce a whole set of other incentives and alternative lines of accountability. I think it would be better than what we have, but it's not that isn't a total solution. I think that the reason why state capture is possible, I'd say, is still very much in swing. Is you have to understand that state capture, may be associated with the Guptas or with President Zuma, but remember that the Great State Capture Project was enunciated by Nelson Mandela in 1997, cadre deployment, politicizing the country's institutions. That was stoutly defended at the Zondo Commission by President Ramaphosa, who in fact said, and you can look this up, I think it's actually in the report, his response was, this adds another layer of accountability. So apparently, if we get rid of cadre deployment, we are really screwed. So look, it's kind of, if you believe this sort of thing, this sort of thing you will believe. And there's a bridge in Newtown that I have up for sale, very reasonable price.
No, well put, Terence. I was very critical of the Zondo Commission while it was ongoing, because I thought this thing is just going to be a talk shop, and it's going to be like almost an emotional airing of grievances. We're going to find out things, and then ultimately nothing will happen. And in that criticism, I was correct. However, what I didn't expect, and what I was very pleasantly surprised by, was some of the recommendations and the powerfulness of the report written by the Chief Justice, which included some things saying that preferential procurement really wasn't a great idea, that this has enabled state capture, which is something that the IRR has said for a long time. And he made a sort of raft of recommendations that I think were very positive and that we really should embrace. But it's probably not surprising that none of them were adopted. Makone, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, I think one thing the Chief Justice points out is that the branches of government are meant to serve as accountability partners to each other, right? But where you have a case such as in South Africa, where the executive is essentially the legislature, you don't see that act of like checks and balances or holding each other accountable coming in, particularly in those two branches. But I absolutely agree with the Chief Justice. And if anything, I've made attempts to go through that mammoth of a report that is the state capture, all 7 parts of them. And I think, one of the finest pieces of investigations to ever come out of South Africa. For a more condensed version, I would recommend a book that was written by, I think her name is Elsa Salzwedel. It's an outer publication. It's titled Parliament Permitted Plundering, How Parliament Failed South Africa. And in it, she details exactly what the Chief Justice is talking about, just numerous occasions that Parliament was presented with in holding members of cabinet, members of Parliament accountable for various acts of corruption, implications directly with the Guptas. They didn't even have to do anything, by the way, because OUTA would just present all of these things to them. They would just have to prosecute or act on holding those members of Parliament accountable. None of that happened, and again, this book does a stellar job of holding government officials accountable. Sorry about that. And one of the ways in which she does that, I'll list 2 occasions on which that happens. One of them is she talks about former Minister of Communications and chairperson of COCTA, Faith Matumbi, for example, how she forwarded confidential cabinet memoranda to the Gupta's ANN7 media publication to help them in their sale of SABC News to ANN7. And she just points out that instead of her being held accountable for that, I believe the Western Cape High Court had made a judgment against Faith Matumbi as Minister of Communications. What you see is she gets moved from one portfolio to the next. You see this with Malusi Gigaba. If he fails as Minister of Home Affairs, he's then shuffled over to Minister of Home Affairs, and the cycle continues. And the message that is essentially sent there is, if you get caught failing here, you are guaranteed a position elsewhere. And if you get caught failing there, then you are guaranteed you will be moved around until you get caught again, and the cycle continues. So I cannot stress the importance of the statements made by the Chief Justice Zondo.
So, Terence, is it maybe fair to say that that the way our system is designed, it really puts a lot of onus on the voters to produce a parliament that is extremely divided politically? Our political our voting system does actually allow for that. You can get into parliament with less than 0.25% of the vote because of the fractions that get added to you. And that parliament has been, in many cases, effectively just a ridiculous rubber stamp up till now. But say there is no party with a majority after the 2024 election, we may be facing a parliament that finally becomes an important part of the political system, because you won't be able to just assume that one party is going to be able to kind of bulldoze their way through everything. And that's regardless of what coalitions are taking place to elect the president or whatever. What do you make of that, Terence?
I think there's two things here. First of all, the way that our electoral system is constituted creates a particular system of representation that prioritizes parties. So yes, if you're a sort of splinter, you form your own party and you can get in. Although I must say, I don't think it's been a hugely significant thing at national level. Municipal level, sure, not national, but I think that you have that which is paired with a particular political culture, and what I'm talking here, political culture, mostly within the ruling ANC, that has sort of views itself as entitled to rule. There's been a lot written about liberation movements and the way they see their role in societies. The ANC has never sort of come, stepped out of this. So yeah, that is, even if the ANC is reduced below 50% or whatever, you could there would be more competition and therefore more leverage. But ironically, there was a time in just after the transition, the sort of mid-90s, where the ANC caucus was actually fairly committed to undertaking accountability. Tony Leon said that lasted until the Serafina 2 scandal, where they were whipped into line. If you look at the ANC caucus at that stage, many of these people were, well, first of all, the ANC had taken all of its talent and put it in parliament, and it did have some talent. Not just people with credentials, but often, real leaders who had done the hard yards over a decade or more. And they actually felt that they were representing the people. Sometimes it was quite exclusionary, but it wasn't just about representing a brand. What's happened in the subsequent period is that these is that particularly the ANC benches have become filled with careerists. These are people who would find it very difficult to find a remunerative position elsewhere. Many of those people in 1994 possibly couldn't either, but they did come with a sense of idealism, that they were bringing a new, they were pioneering a new form of government. And the ANC, to quote Richard Calland, is a forgiving organization. It's been very, very, very forgiving. Now, I would also say that many commentators were, and perhaps Mr. Calland, Professor Calland, is one of these. I actually esteem him as an analyst, but I think his own writing is sometimes very forgiving of the ANC's conduct as well. They, as an organization, I think it was allowed to get away with a great deal, and ultimately, the voters of South Africa, in whatever proportion, continued to endorse it. I don't. No, I will also stick up for your ANC voter, because everyone has must elect whom they choose, and the ANC did deliver some very tangible benefits if you think about social grants and whatever. Question is, though, you reach a point of breakdown, and I think that may be where we're going, and also reach a point where the resources that are available within the system you have just won't satisfy the aspirations of people who want something better. Like your childcare grant is not particularly what somebody who's hoping to work in a high rise in Sandton wants.
Right. Child grant is not the foundation of a secure and happy future.
Correct.
All right, let's move on to our next story now. And this comes, I think, originally from a article on MoneyWeb, which talks about how South Africans are some of the most indebted people in the world. South Africans spend as much as 73% of their disposable household income on just servicing debt repayments. And that people were vulnerable, many South Africans were vulnerable to predatory practices, this report claims, by creditor agencies due to prevailing levels of poverty and financial illiteracy, which leave many people unable to place their problems effectively before the courts. Unsecured credit card debt, for example, was 18 billion rand by 2022. And just as an example of how much of this is going before the courts, in May of 2019, the courts granted 19,000 judgments for debt worth 342 million rand, and 47,000 summonses were issued for debt recovery in that same period. The authors of this article go on to say that they think that the problem here is that the law is not protective enough of people who are deeply in debt, and that the state should make greater efforts to ensure that the benefit of the doubt is essentially given to people who owe money as opposed to those who lend money. But to me, that seems very much like a kind of band-aid solution, which will just result in higher interest rates and less credit being given to people who desperately want it. Makone, let's start with you. Firstly, what do you make of the recommendations that we should be more lenient on people who borrow money? But secondly, why do you think that South Africans are just so crippled by debt?
I think I'll start with the second part. We produced a report, actually, Gerbrand van Heerden, who often visits on the show, did a middle class report showing how much indebted they are. And I think it's one thing to have a high household income to debt ratio. It's another thing when that debt is unsecured. And what's happened as we've seen interest rates hike after interest rate hike is that people are leaning more and more into dipping into unsecured credit to supplement income shortfalls. So I think people are just under great financial strain. They do this thing where they model, like, if you owe 200,000 rands on your car and you have a million rand worth of a mortgage, they try to show how much are you still owing on that in terms of debt servicing costs. And what they're able to show is just over the last 3 years, you're paying 5,000 rand more in servicing those two debts as a consumer. So one other thing to point out is, of course, that the rand has lost its value. I think the middle class has lost something like 38% in income purchasing power since 2016. So not only are people dipping into unsecured credit to cover for those income shortfalls, but the rand can't even take you as far as it could just 7 years ago. And then in terms of law, I think there is a place to have this conversation about the role that the government can play in helping with credit. I don't think it's credit leniency. I think courts need to play a role in helping make contract or lease agreements or credit agreements become far easier for people to interpret. In the article, they point out that poverty and literacy are some of the reasons why people get into these credit agreements. But I think it's one thing to be literate, it's another thing to be legally literate, to really understand legal jargon and contracts and so forth. So I think the courts can play a role in just sort of making contract law more accessible to the ordinary person, to the reasonable man. and I think that's a role that government can play. Otherwise, I think documents like, or laws like the National Credit Regulation Act, as well as the Consumer Protection Act, do a stellar job in providing extensive protections to consumers. But I do think there is a huge loophole in interpretation of contracts, even translation. Like, let's make contracts available in languages that people can actually understand.
I must say that debt really seems like a symptom of the much deeper problems, as you kind of say, Makone, that everyone is under this ridiculous level of stress, and that the situation is deteriorating, so that people who used to be stable are now having to rely more and more on debt. Terence, what do you make of this story?
Well, once again, I think come back to some extent to culture. I think that there's a very consumptive part of being a South African. I remember actually working with this lady once, and she just bought a new car. It was like Taz or something, small and run around. And I think like the day after that, she said, "Well, when she upgrades, she's going to get a BMW." It's like, well, you just got your car, enjoy it for the moment. But that seems to be the way that many of us think. I think part of that actually comes with being in an extreme, living in a country with extreme inequalities. I think that for many poor people sort of rank their own life experiences against the somewhat more affluent. So a guy living in a tin shed, once the sort of formal house and car arrangement. People living in a suburb, want the bigger suburb. We've always had a problem. South Africa's always had a problem with saving, even in the good times. I remember Trevor Manuel talking about this. Whereas I think Singapore saved something in the region of 30% of its income. In South Africa, I don't know, I'm not sure of the exact number, but I think it's single digits, and sometimes none at all. Now, there are also a number of kind of structural things. Cities are very spread out, so particularly poorer people have to spend an enormous amount traveling. If you're lucky enough to have a job. You have the phenomenon of extended families where the one guy with a job ends up having to support a very wide circle of people, and amongst the middle class there is still the expectation that you're going to have a comfortable life. So there's still the trip to Plettenberg Bay and well, if anyone can afford that these days. Let's say you go to the South Coast, over Christmas. All of that chews up a great deal. Plus, of course, the sort of lifestyle costs of making up for the failures of the state. Your private education, your medical aid, etc., etc., etc. I think
security companies.
Yeah, it all adds up, and then you sort of end up running your credit card over time. Someone says, how much can you save every evening, sit down to eat to 6 additional people? Absolutely. That's the problem. There's very little. There's not enough to sort of cover your current lifestyle. And I think a lot of the unsecured lending is probably sort of not just happening through formal institutions, but loan sharks, or that's a few, or maybe friends or family if you're lucky. So I think a lot of this is not really captured.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the other things driving this, is that in South Africa we've got a relatively small group of people who have stable incomes, and they are supporting often many family members. I know that whenever they kind of do these studies of people and how many dependents they have, the numbers are very high. I remember this back when there were those big strikes on the mines, and there were miners earning sort of 15,000 Rand a month as an entry thing. And the question was, why are they complaining about not being able to afford living costs at all when you're doing that? And that's because each of those miners was supporting like 8 people because unemployment is so high. People expect one job to have to cover stuff, and I'm sure that adds as well to the debt burden here. Makone, final thoughts on this story?
So yeah, that's true. The part about people supporting extended family members, I think people call it black tax, but I don't think it's strictly black people that do that. I think that's actually one argument people make for why you'll never see nationwide protests take up the form of riots over inequality or extreme poverty in South Africa, is that there's people are being supported by other family members and they make up for where those people cannot afford. But I do think that people are under great financial strain. I don't think that's necessarily a role that government needs to fill. If anything, I think that should be motivation to go out in 2024 and go and vote, because part of why people's purchasing power has reduced so much is poor financial policy and poor decision making coming out of government. And you can only have a say in that every 5 years, and that opportunity is presenting itself again next year. And so we should go out in the numbers and do something about it.
All right, let's move quickly to our final story for today. And this is President Cyril Ramaphosa was speaking at the ANC's Western Cape elective conference. The ANC in the Western Cape has not had a particularly good couple of years. Ever since the ANC lost power in the province, it's been in a sort of kind of what seems like a bit of a death spiral. It's had lots of infighting. It's really struggled, and I think every single election it's shrunk its vote share in that province. But Ramaphosa expressed confidence. He said that he thinks that the Western Cape can really turn it around, especially if they are unified. He said, I would like you as the Western Cape ANC to surprise everyone, to surprise even those within our own ranks who sometimes think that, no, the Western Cape for the ANC is a lost cause. We are not a lost cause. We can achieve a clear majority. He also went on to talk about coalitions at national government. Ramaphosa said, people often ask me, are you going to win the next election? I said, that is a very silly question. We are going to win the next election without any doubt. He said that this would only happen, however, if the ANC remained united, and that this was the single most important factor towards them winning the next election. He said that if the party was not united, that they would, quote, start off as losers. He said, however, if they were united, that victory was certain. In my own head, I do not think of coalitions because it is going to be a straight win, a straight victory, said Ramaphosa. Makone, what do you make of Ramaphosa's confidence?
These kind of remarks remind me of Donald Trump. You know, they're very, very ambitious and they're big. We're going to win big. It just reminds me of that. I wish he was as confident about the
We're going to
ANC
win
as
huge.
you.
You're going to get tired of winning.
That's one of my favorite videos, Terence. But I think I wish he was as confident about South Africa as he is about the ANC. I call false optimism on this. I can't help but beam when you were talking about the ANC in the Western Cape and its downward spiral. It's just involuntarily just beaming. But I think he's speaking just confidently, but I don't think the reality on the ground is reflective of those comments. But I do admire the optimism.
Terence, interesting here that he doesn't say, if we make the right choices, if we campaign well, anything like that. He just says, as long as we stay united as a party. And I think this really does reflect how Ramaphosa has in fact governed, which is ANC unity, basically above all other priorities.
Look, I've said this before. I think that Ramaphosa has fundamentally performed his term of office as the president of the ANC, not the president of South Africa. You're quite right. I think that it's his prime purpose to keep the ANC together, because that's kind of I'm not sure there's a great deal of strategic thinking behind it, but if it splits, then they probably lose. It's that sort of very baseline thinking. No, look, he's I suppose, as my late mother would say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's it's sort of blithe confidence. It's very much in the same line as we combat state capture and as we rebuild our institutions, while we keep cadre deployment there, because it's such a gift to accountability in South Africa. And as we go to solve the world's problems, and just wait, coming around the corner. But I think there's also something there that speaks to the political culture of a liberation movement, that you need to remain united, you need to keep together, you must always keep on going forward, even when there's no sense of what you actually want to do with going forward. So look, for what it's worth, I'm gonna make my call now, and you can hold me to it. The ANC will not get a majority in the Western Cape.
Yeah. Although who knows? You never know that maybe maybe the DA gets 49% of the vote there, and then suddenly the ANC is back in power in the Western Cape. That would be a political earthquake.
Look, someone I know who lives there and who's not particularly DA sympathetic once said to me, Western Cape ANC does all the campaigning the DA needs.
I suspect that they will probably be a fairly irrelevant part of the Western Cape in the next election, regardless of how well the DA does there. Anyway, that's not a discussion. I think for now we are out of time. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope that you all have a wonderful day. And we will see you tomorrow for a short version of the Daily Friend at 5. Have a good one, everyone. Cheerio.